Welcome to World Review, our weekly discussion of news from around the world. I'm Carla Robbins, a recovering Wall Street Journal and New York Times journalist, now at the Council on Foreign Relations in Baruch College, sitting in for the redoubtable Ivo Dalder. Today, we're going to be looking at summit season in Europe, meetings of the EU, G7, and NATO. Can world leaders stave off Ukraine fatigue and address a host of troubles, including soaring gas prices, inflation, and a world food shortage? Russia's energy squeeze and the looming recarbonization of Europe, and a big win for the left and the right in France's parliamentary elections, and Colombia's first left-wing president. Here with us to discuss these issues are my colleagues from New York City, Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Ravi, I think this is your first time on. Welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks.
From Berlin, Sylvie Kauffmann, editorial director of Le Monde and currently a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. Sylvie, it has been far too long, and I'm so happy to see you again.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And from London, Giles Whittell, World Affairs editor of Tortoise Media. Giles and I are only virtual friends, but I'm always happy to see you again virtually. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So Ravi, can we start with you? The EU kicked off the summit marathon on Thursday in Brussels, where the very much anticipated news was the extension of candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. Whether these two ever make it in is another issue, but we are hoping that this is a strong message to Vladimir Putin. On Sunday, leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest democracies go to Schloss Elmo. I went and looked it up. They have Wi-Fi free and an indoor pool for the G7 meeting. And then on Wednesday, the show moves on to Madrid for the NATO Summit. And oh yes, in the midst of all this, Xi Jinping hosted a virtual summit of the BRICS. No swag, but Vladimir Putin was very much in attendance. So what are the big issues you and your writers are going to be watching for in all these meetings?
Well, quite a few. I mean, so chronologically, the BRICS Summit was first. That was on Wednesday. Crucially, this was virtual, although it was hosted by Beijing. Interesting takeaways from there were some of the obvious ones in that, China made a point about how there are all these moves underway to sort of isolate it. It's sort of Xi Jinping had his usual diatribe against bloc mentality and all of that. But of course, this was also an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to show that he can share a virtual screen with the leader of the world's largest democracy, Narendra Modi, for example. So not just Xi Jinping, but also the leaders of India, South Africa, and Brazil. Quite a statement on the part of the BRICS to have that meeting in the way that they did. Although again, caveat, it was virtual. In a weird way, the BRICS is sort of a backdrop, as it were, to much of the G7 and NATO meetings in the coming days. So starting with the G7, you'll remember from last year, for example, a big part of the G7 meetings in Cornwall in England were what was then called a Build Back Better World, or B3W plan, which was aimed at potentially countering China's Belt and Road. All of that's not going to happen this time. I think this time the focus is much more clearly on a real crisis that's underway in Europe. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is going to want to bring up the topic of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. We'll be looking at the specifics. What exactly can countries in Europe and around the world, America, of course, do to shore up Ukraine's economy, which will contract likely by 45% this year? Of course, much of this is going to be planning for the future. So a sense of when the war ends, not now, but when it ends, what can the world do to help Ukraine? I mentioned that China is a backdrop to all of this because, of course, European countries, America, they're constrained a little bit. You don't want to hold China back. You don't want to talk of sanctions too much because, as we will discuss later on this program, every country is struggling with inflation. That's having ripple effects on domestic politics everywhere. So I think the focus will be much more just on Ukraine and what to do there. And that leads us nicely into the NATO summit, which will be in Madrid. Interestingly enough, it's not just NATO in attendance. We also have Japan, South Korea in attendance. Which will add a different flavor. That there are already reports that China will be discussed at NATO as NATO looks to sort of expand its purpose from just being a sort of Russia-aligned organization, aligned against Russia, to also include China. It'll be very interesting to look at the specifics that emerge from there, what can be done. Obviously, look for a response from Beijing there.
So are Finland and Sweden going to get in?
Well, this was something that was seen as that's something that would happen quite quickly and automatically. Turkey has other plans, as it were. And I think Turkey, for domestic reasons, mostly Erdogan has tried to sort of put a spanner in the works, despite, by the way, assuring Finland many months ago that he would support their bid to join NATO. That, of course, will be discussed as well at this summit. But the thing is, as long as Turkey wants to hold this up, it kind of can. It's trying to extract some promises from Finland and Sweden, some more promises from the West more broadly, from America. And all the cards are in Erdogan's hands on that front. I think, again, the understanding is that this will happen. Finland and Sweden will end up joining NATO, but delayed.
So because NATO is a consensus organization, so just one member can hold everything up, which interestingly enough is one of the things that the EU has been worried about every time it adds more people. And there's some discussion even at the summit this week about we add more people, and particularly a country as big as Ukraine, ultimately, do we have to keep rethinking how we do our voting? Not everything is on consensus. Some of it is population based in the EU. For Erdogan, it's all about the Kurds, and he'd also like to get back on the F-35 deal. I don't think he's going to get that one. So Giles, what are you going to be looking at? And I know there was another summit, that you were paying attention to in Kigali, and there was that tea and biscuits, rather uncomfortable meeting between Prince Charles and the PM. So which ones do you care about?
Personally, I'm interested in what is known as the CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which this year is in Kigali, only as the least significant summit of all of these in geopolitical terms. But it's one, of course, that we Brits feel somehow obliged to pay attention to because we always send a royal, and our royals are the conveners. It's delicious politically because there's, I know it's not part of our agenda today, but there's this absurd refugee deportation program that is currently mired at the European Court of Human Rights to Rwanda, which is, I'm going to venture to say, pretty close to being a police state. And so it's embarrassing. It would have been embarrassing for Boris Johnson to be there anyway, but doubly so because the Prince of Wales has called his deportation plan appalling. So it's good theatre for us Brits, whatever's happening in Kigali. I just wanted to say on the NATO summit, can I just put my tuppence in there?
Please.
It felt initially...
Is that 2% of your GDP at tuppence?
Yeah, that's about it now. That's what it's worth. Do you want to get into growth foregone as a result of Brexit? We could do that too. 100 billion a year, I gather. Anyway, at the beginning of the Finnish-Swedish bid for membership, it felt as if Erdogan was simply maneuvering to exact his price. And you were asking, what would we look into? If I had the resources at Tortoise and we're still only a startup, I'd like to do some reporting on Turkish-Russian diplomacy because there plainly will have been, because Turkey wants to keep a role as a broker in Ukraine-Russia peace talks. But I do worry that perhaps Erdogan's position has shifted from seeking his tribute, as it were, for cooperation to a more stubborn resistance to Finnish-Swedish membership, which would pose a real challenge to the consensus model that you mentioned.
And there's also, because the Turks are also been, trying to be the broker on the food question. And,
Yeah.
there's, are they going to, I mean, the Russians want some sort of a deal there in which there's going to be access, to potentially to Odessa, in exchange for, I mean, they're holding the world hostage on food, and the Turks are also allegedly playing an honest broker role in that one. And I'd like to know what's behind the scenes on that as well. So yes, I think I hope you get the resources for that, or maybe FP will pick it up for you.
That would be great.
That would be great. I'm a subscriber. I want to read it. So Sylvie, what have you been most focused on in the summit parade?
Now, obviously, here in Europe, it's all about Ukraine. First, I really want to point out the importance of this, of granting the candidate status to Ukraine. From the European Union's point of view, it's a really historic decision. It's very important. I mean, it was not a done deal a couple of weeks ago. So their leaders, the leaders of the 27, really have rallied around this initiative. There's been a lot of work done between the leaders to convince the reluctant one, and I think finally Scholz, Macron, Draghi, and it was not enough attention was paid to the fact that they took the Romanian president with them. It's important because that was the Central Europe element added, and it finally carried the day. So that's very important. Of course, there's something which tarnished this decision yesterday was the failure to make progress on the Western, on the accession of the Western Balkans countries. So there was quite a lot of bitter feelings yesterday in Brussels. Otherwise, something that Ravi said about the BRICS summit, I find it interesting that it is still virtual. And, Western leaders have been meeting in person for now quite a long time. And I think this is still a very big problem China and the COVID situation is still something which has to be noted. And last thing, also at the G7, some leaders from the global south are invited, right? So the leaders of India, Indonesia, I don't know if they will all join in person, of Indonesia, India, South Africa, the leader, Macky Sall, also the Senegalese president who is chairing the African Union. I think there are 5 of them. And this reflects the concern that has been mounting recently among European leaders, which is they realize that they have really missed the opportunity to do some work with these leaders of the global south. They were very naive at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. They thought with these votes in the UN General Assembly that these abstentions, that was quite good. I remember that some of them were quite happy at the beginning about these votes. And then they realized they were losing the battle of the narrative, as they say, and that the Russian narrative about the food crisis being all blamed on the Western sanctions against Russia is a very, very negative development for Europeans. So they have decided to really try to work on this. I don't know whether they'll succeed, but at least at the G7, these invitations are aiming at this.
So, it is interesting the way that Modi manages to move from summit to summit to summit, and seems to get a pass, in this. He can go from the BRICS to the G7, from the Quad, and all of this. I suppose you've got a really big country and it's a democracy, sort of. It's a remarkable pass. So, Giles, let's talk about Putin's gas squeeze, which is a pretty extraordinary thing. I mean, last week, Russia cut flows 60% through the Nord Stream 1. There is a Nord Stream 1. We always talk about 2 pipeline, which runs under the Baltic Sea to Germany. How bad is it? And how bad is it going to be for the environment? I mean, Germany's environment minister has announced that they're going to resume burning coal. And the Dutch are saying that. The Italians are warning they're going to have to do this as well. And there's a draft G7 proposal, separate from coal, talking about using tax money to, do massive natural gas projects as a response to Russia's war, which is going to undercut the group's climate pledges. So how bad is this? Are we looking at like 1970s gas lines? And how bad is it for the environment?
I think it's safe to say the short answer is really bad. It's really sunny and warm in London now, so we won't know how bad until the nights start drawing in and people want to switch on their heating in October, November. By the way, in October, the UK introduces another hike in its gas, that is natural gas price hike. So here we'll feel a second major step increase in cost of living. In the rest of Europe, it's more gradual. But the story starts, in a sense, with this peculiar anecdote about, it's not anecdotal, it's real, about a compressor stuck in Canada. The Russian position is that it cannot pump as much gas through Nord Stream 1 as it used to because of a Siemens compressor that can only be repaired in Montreal and is stuck there because of sanctions. And this is the excuse it is given for, as you say, severely restricting gas supplies to Germany with a knock-on effect. France, Italy, and several other European countries that already are getting no Russian gas because they've refused to pay for it in rubles. But European leaders don't buy the explanation. It seems very convenient that this compressor has got stuck there. But what has happened is that European efforts to build up their reserves in time for next winter have kind of plateaued with storage tanks half full. They need to be 80% full with a view to a 90% Russian gas cutoff for next winter. That is the target that the EU has set itself in order to end its dependency and, in principle, stop funding the Russian war in Ukraine, as it were. There are a couple of problems here. One is that actually Russia makes 4/5 of its hydrocarbons revenues from the sale of oil, which it continues to do without any problem at all, albeit at a discount to other buyers, mainly in Asia, who aren't so concerned about the war. And even with that discount, Russia is getting historically high prices per barrel for its oil. But back in Europe, what Russia is managing to do is turn the EU's gas policy against it. And as you say, facing a gas squeeze, Germany and then Austria and now the Netherlands are bringing coal back online. Coal is, of course, the most carbon intensive of all the fossil fuels. The first to be cut by European countries trying to limit their carbon footprints, very, very successfully, by the way. I mean, if you want an object lesson in how to do this, and I don't usually carry water for any UK government, but between what in the sort of 7 years from 2010 to 2017, the UK, simply by shutting down coal-fired power stations, took its overall power generation carbon footprint back to pre-19th century levels. It's the way to do it. And the way to do it is not happening in all these European countries now as a direct result of Russian energy policy. You say, how bad for the environment? It couldn't be worse, really. And it's almost tempting to look at Putin now as a real uber villain, because he knows how climate change is affecting Russia. You talk to any Moscow resident, and their winters are a thing of the past. Their permafrost is melting. They know that. But you can almost imagine that it's part of his strategy to turn Siberia into a new pasture land and the Arctic Ocean into a new shipping route.
Spectre. Smurf. Oh my God. Sylvie, you're in Berlin. What does it feel like there? I mean, how's the gas? I mean, they're talking, I gather they've got like 3 levels of, a crisis, and they're moved to the second and talking about the third. How does it feel? I mean, is panic setting in?
Yeah, it's a little bit paradoxical because there's been almost a heat wave recently. So it's very warm outside. You know, there's no so much air conditioning in Europe as you have in the States. So there's not this huge spending of electricity when it's hot outside, and so people don't necessarily see themselves already in the cold of the winter. But the economics and climate minister, Robert Habeck, who is the green, quite powerful, you know, the leader. I mean, he's not formally the leader of the Greens anymore, but he's the most powerful figure after the chancellor in the government. And he's actually really very much a rising star. He's quite successful politically at the moment. Had a very impressive press conference yesterday where he even at some stages was almost emotional because he was really linking the situation. He was very blunt and bold, I would say, with German citizens, telling them this is going to be very difficult. We'll have difficult times ahead. We have really a difficult situation when the winter comes. But this is the price of freedom. We are doing this because Putin, we will have to do this effort collectively because Putin is a dictator. He's attacking freedoms in Ukraine. And if we don't want him to attack our freedoms, we have to do this together. So that was quite, I think, quite impressive, but we are not in the thick of it yet, right? And so what Giles just said is the cold truth, if I may say, that coal energy with coal is being used again, and there's even also. Which is obviously terrible for climate change. And there's also, and imagine being a green minister and you have to take those measures, right? And also, you know, there's going to be a discussion in Germany about nuclear energy, and that's also a big taboo for the Greens. The Liberal, you know, it's a three-party coalition, so the Liberal Party has already started to talk about this, whether maybe we should debate not closing our nuclear power plants so early. And you know, the debate has not really started, but it's bound to happen. So this is really about Germany, I think, and also Italy. France is not in such a situation because there is nuclear energy, and only 10% of the gas in France was coming from Russia. And also, yes, Germany doesn't have LNG terminals, right? So that's another problem for bringing in LNG. So, but anyway, as a whole in Europe, I think it's taking stock now that we are going to face a very complex situation when the winter comes.
And that's one of the concerns, of course, is that if the Germans invest in LNG infrastructure, you know, now to get over it, they're not, you know, investing in renewables. And once the sunk cost on the infrastructure is going to slow down the transition to renewables. I mean, you can see this. I mean, the Americans say, we'll send you LNG, and the Germans say, we can't receive it. It's really hard to. So the sunk cost on infrastructure, you know, could, and we don't have a lot of time here. This is, you know, this, you're right. I'm going with Giles' Ubervillain explanation of that. That's pretty damn scary. So Ravi, the ruble has made an incredible comeback over the last week, and all the reports suggest, as you know, Giles and Sylvie were talking about, that surging energy prices mean that the sanctions so far are hurting Europe and the US far more than it's hurting Russia. So is this a temporary reprieve for the Russians, or do we need to rethink the tools we have to pressure Putin to get out of Ukraine?
It is a temporary reprieve of sorts. And remember also there are other countries that are stepping in to buy Russian oil and gas. China has dramatically increased its purchases. India has dramatically increased its purchases. I believe in the month of April, India imported as much gas from Russia as it did as much crude, from Russia as it did in all of 2021. So that's how much the level of the increases we're seeing, which are, you know, to a degree, to a great degree, sort of blunting the impact of Europe reducing its imports of Russian oil and gas by about 50%. But one thing that strikes me about this whole debate is that there is a short-term strategy which is hurting Russia, mitigating the energy crunch in Europe. That's one thing. There is a longer-term thing here that I think leaders really need to consider. As Sylvie alluded to, Germany made a mistake over the last 8 or 9 years when, even after Russia's invasion of Crimea and Georgia, it deepened ties with Russia. It expanded its imports of Russian oil and gas. And on top of that, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, Japan didn't switch off nuclear energy, but Germany did. And one can debate that, but the reality is this: Germany, Europe, and much of the rich world simply hasn't invested enough money in clean energy sources for the future. The FT had a great set of statistics where it showed that after the 2015 Paris Agreement, the world was increasing its investments in clean energy by 2% a year. That's nothing. After 2020, it was increasing it by 12% a year. Also, by the way, nothing when you factor in inflation, which is running in the high single digits globally, which then means much of that 12% is actually just factoring in increased costs of construction and labor. So given all of that, I think that's where the world is falling short. We need a dramatic, big plan for clean energy, not just for Europe, but also for the developing world, because if you plan to hurt a country like Russia, you also have to ensure that countries like India, countries in the global south, that their needs for energy are being met as well. And remember this when we come to the COP meetings later this year. Europe is doubling down on coal right now. Europe loves to tell the rest of the world, you need to move away from coal. But suddenly Europe's tune has changed because it's saying that it is a priority to keep the lights on. Well, that priority exists for other countries too around the world. So this is a global, big conversation that needs to be addressed in a serious way with big money.
We'll see whether the G7 does any of that or spends all of its time talking about how it's going to get past the near-term crisis. And I fear that there's going to be rhetorical commitments, but it's all going to be tactical in reality. But we'll see. Maybe my cynicism will be proved wrong. So Sylvie, Macron got what we in the US would call quite a shellacking in parliamentary elections, losing his majority, and he's now wedged between a rising far left and far right parties. 2 questions quickly. Is this a sign of profound polarization in France, or is this just an anyone but Macron vote a few months after he was reelected to the presidency? And is he a lame duck?
If he's the lame duck, that's going to be difficult because there are 5 years to go, right? So I don't think he will allow himself to be a lame duck for long. No, I think he has enough personal resources and energy, but he is in a very difficult situation at the moment. I would say it's very much of his own making. But there is also a strong trend of polarization. You're absolutely right, which we have been observing for some time and which is very familiar to you in the US. So what happened basically is that he made a big mistake, Macron, not to campaign after the presidential election. There was this legislative election 6 weeks after the presidential election, and he apparently assumed that it would be just a natural sequel to his victory, which was quite an achievement actually to be re-elected, taking into account the crisis he has been through in his first term. That was quite something, but he just decided that there was no reason to really campaign and that French voters would just follow up. And obviously that didn't happen because 2 things happen. First, by not campaigning, he left the field open to this radical left leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who managed to set up an alliance of four left-wing parties, the four small left-wing parties, but being with our electoral system majority with 2 rounds, it was very important for them to be united, and that gave them much better chances to get more seats in parliament. And so Mélenchon just dominated the media scene for several weeks. He was the only one there because we thought that Marine Le Pen didn't campaign, but she did campaign. She didn't do what Macron did. She did campaign, but under the radar, at least under the radar of the national media. And that was a very, very smart move. I think this is a little bit similar to the Brexit campaign, in fact, she really went. Her candidates really went at a grassroots level, at a local level. They ran a very effective campaign, and on polling day, what happened? They got 89 seats in Parliament, which is up to 7 in the previous parliament. So this was the big shock. In fact, that was a shock to everybody. And I think it was even a surprise to Marine Le Pen herself. She didn't expect that many MPs to get in. So yes, now we have 3 blocks politically. We have one radical left, we have one far right, and we have this centrist bloc, which is the presidential party, if I can call it the party. It's not really a party, it's the movement, and it's small centrist allies. So Macron doesn't have an absolute majority in parliament. He needs to find allies. So he's courting the center-right party, which used to be Sarkozy's party, and it's really very weak now, but which has enough MPs to make a majority for Macron if they agree. At the moment, they don't want to agree because Macron has spent a lot of time trying to destroy this party. So why should they give him a favor now? That's going to take some time. They've been meeting. Otherwise, his government will have to negotiate every bill, basically, to have to get some votes in parliament for every single bill, which obviously will have to be watered down. And so his reform agenda is not looking good, right? And we don't know what's going to happen, whether it's, the French are not very good at the culture of compromise. The center-right party leader the other day was asked whether he would make some compromise with Macron. He said, look, I'm not German. So no, we don't have this German culture of compromise. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult. And there's always the possibility, if it doesn't work for several months, there's a possibility of, dissolving the National Assembly. But it's not necessarily a recipe for success. And just one last thing, another worrisome feature of this election was the very, very low turnout, right? Less than, I think it was 47 point something % of voters turned out, came to vote. And this is a record low in France. That shows also the level of disillusionment of French voters with their political system and their political class. So this is not a very encouraging landscape, I'm afraid.
So Macron never seems to suffer from much self-doubt. One wonders whether he's suffering from a moment of self-doubt here. Who knows what goes on inside?
Some people say he's been humbled, but how long can he stay humbled? I don't know.
Yeah. So Ravi, how left is the new left-wing president of Colombia, or is he? He seems to be talking more than anything else about the environment since he got elected.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he's an ex-guerrilla. He's ran as a political outsider of sorts, which seems to be a popular theme, I guess, in many countries around the world, to say that I'm not from the capital, I can bring change. But, more broadly, some of his policies, wants to renegotiate a free trade agreement with the US, reestablish relations with Maduro in Venezuela, who the US still doesn't formally recognize. But you're right, the main sort of thing he has been talking about is climate change. And I think the key policy here to be aware of is he wants to limit new oil and gas exploration in Colombia, which is a really big deal, actually. I think the country with the biggest exports that currently does that is Denmark. And in Denmark, crude oil accounts for just 1% of their total exports. For Colombia, crude oil accounts for 23% of its global exports. So this decision to not grant contracts for new oil and gas exploration is going to cost Colombia billions of dollars. I think by one estimate, by the year 2026, it could cost them $4.5 billion. So this is going to hit their budget. The interesting thing here is that it's actually quite popular. So it seems like, he has telegraphed these intentions well ahead of time. I think Colombians want to try it. They want to not only diversify their economy, I think they also seem to care a fair bit about cleaner energy sources and about Colombia doing its bit towards that end. So I would watch out for this. If Colombia is able to figure out how to diversify its energy sources, then it could hold some lessons for the rest of the world.
Something upbeat. I almost want to end on that note, but we still have some more time. So, Giles, I'm obsessed with the January 6th hearings in the U.S. I don't know how much, if you had any time to watch them. And now we've had two incredible Supreme Court rulings, between the gun ruling yesterday and now overturning of Roe versus Wade. How much are people in Britain paying attention to what's going on here in what is a pretty extraordinary time for the United States, not just the usual, what Sylvie referred to, polarization, political gridlock and all? This is major policy, both, inner workings of what looked like almost a coup in the United States under Donald Trump, and major changes in policies that in Europe look, pretty strange. Guns for everybody, and after 50 years, no longer abortion on demand.
Right. We're paying attention in the news business. We're paying attention. These stories make the big bulletins as well. To that extent, the general public is paying attention. And of course, the January 6 hearings make great TV. I mean, I haven't been following them as closely as you, but they gave me, among other things, an opportunity to watch for the first time a particular video compilation of the assault. There are many, of course. And I came away slightly, to my own surprise, trying to see it from their point of view. If you move over into the parallel universe in which you believe that the election was stolen, and you follow them through the doors, talking in incoherent but sort of brotherly language to some of the police, many of whom were then beaten up, of course, as well. You can see that they think of themselves as some kind of 18th century freedom fighters. But it's a completely parallel universe, and that's the really troubling thing for an observer, is to wonder how the real world and the imaginary world in American politics can come together before the imaginary one destroys American democracy. Just a couple of points on Supreme Court rulings. A colleague of mine was just staring in disbelief, even though we knew it was coming, at today's judgment in Roe v. Wade, which was so similar to the leaked one by Alito a couple of months back, and B, makes the obvious but irrelevant point right at the top that there's no mention of abortion in the Constitution. Again, a late 18th century document. So your country where I have lived for many years and for which all my kids have passports and citizenship, is allowing itself to have generations of law interpreted by hobbyists who seem to regard the Constitution as a document in aspic. But the other peculiar thing about the New York ruling to me is that it upheld a complaint against New York state gun law, which limits open carry, the carrying of guns in public. And yet this is the Supreme Court whose Chief Justice, correct me if I'm wrong here, but also many of the conservative justices are known for their support of states' rights, and who in other contexts will uphold states' rights over federal overreach readily. So again, I mean, not just interpreting the Constitution in aspic, but also guided more by ideology than law. That's what it seems to me.
Sorry, Ravi.
Sorry.
No, please. Aspic, yes. Ravi, how, you have a lot of experience working around the world. How do you think it's playing? I mean, and you've got reporters, around the world. How are these extraordinary days playing right now?
I mean, we all know that the rest of the world looks at America very keenly. They observe trends here. They observe challenges here. And I think, if you speak to any American diplomat who is traveling abroad, American policymakers who travel abroad, they're often asked questions about things that are going on at home. It challenges them because, you can't preach about democracy on the one hand, and then have essentially an anti-democratic movement with support from certain Congress people underway. It's harder for America to preach in the way it often does abroad. But also, I think, one of the things that American policymakers often get asked when they go abroad is, especially Democratic policymakers, is, okay, so you are promising X, Y, or Z when it comes to climate change. You are promising to be robust on international alliances. What happens when your counterparts, what happens when the Republicans are back in power, or Trump more specifically is back in power? And it's a tough set of things to grapple with. There are no easy answers. And I think when you have decisions like this, I'm referring to Roe v. Wade specifically here, you realize that Trump might not be in power, but his legacy, in a sense, lives on. 3 Supreme Court justices, each of whom is in their 50s, they will be with us for many more years, decades to come. And that really, in a sense, is one of Trump's many enduring legacies, not so easy to brush off abroad. And I imagine other world leaders will be asking Biden about this at the G7, at NATO and beyond.
So Sylvie, I've always felt, and I think the French, at least I would like to think, have this strong sense of shared democracy with America. The January 6 hearings and how close we came to a coup, has that had resonance, or is it?
Yes, no, I totally agree with what Giles and Ravi just said. It's a huge concern here in Europe. In this new security situation created by the war in Ukraine, by Russia's aggression, all every forum or conference or conversation I take part in at the moment is about the future security order. How can we build, more security for Europe? And in every conversation comes this. It's all about how NATO has been strengthened and the Europeans have been united. But then there's always this point. But what will happen in 2024? And we have to factor this in, and we have to take measures to protect ourselves from this. So this is really a major issue for us in Europe. Yes, what's going on in Washington, D.C. And those news obviously are very bad signs. Yeah.
So I wanted to end on a happier note. Maybe we'll go back to talking about green policies in Colombia. That's it for this week. I really want to thank Sylvie Kauffmann of Le Monde and the Robert Bosch Academy, Giles Whittell of Tortoise Media, and Ravi, our newcomer but fabulous, Agrawal of FP, for a great conversation. Evo will be back next week for another edition of World Review. And to everyone, please keep watching and have a very safe weekend, and see you all soon. Thank you, guys. It was great.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.